it's like, oh, bass. Cool. You know how you make the bass better? Crank the bass up. Yeah. You know how to make the kick drum better? Crank the bass up. And it's like, no, not really. But
yeah, I mean, we want to use all the fancy tools like EQ and compression and, you know, phase alignments and things like that.
Yeah. And now it's, no, put a multi-band on it.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, the podcast bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Jeff Turzo, a musician, producer, and founder of Overstayer recording equipment, a company that designs cool audio gear for the studio. I first learned about Jeff through my friends in Los Angeles, Matt Mahaffey on episode 69 and Chris James, who's on episode 75. Both these guys kept raving about this guy who would build crazy awesome gear for their studios, and now I had to meet him, so here we are finally. Jeff started out as a musician and spent a decade producing and touring with his band God Lives Underwater, first signed by Rick Rubin to American Recordings in 1993. And GLU, that's what you guys go by, GLU?
Yeah, that's what most people called it.
All right, cool. So GLU went on to record multiple albums with a heavy guitar, synth, loop-driven pop sound that landed them a movie soundtrack hit for the Keanu Reeves film Johnny Mnemonic. I think I'm saying that right. Mnemonic, right? Yeah. And airtime on alternative rock stations and MTV. This led to years of touring for his band, sharing the stage with other heavy pop bands like KMFDM, Korn, Filter, Deftones, No Doubt, and Sublime. In the studio, Jeff was a multi-instrumentalist and producer with synthesis, sampling knowledge, sometimes producing with Matt Mahaffey, but also with his GLU partner, David Reilly, staying busy with remix projects that included Skinny Puppy, Rob Zombie, and Messiah. He also organized a record called For the Masses, a tribute to Depeche Mode in 1998, and released finally Up on the Floor with GLU in 2004. As a result of his fascination with synths and recording, Jeff ultimately began designing and building his own gear for the studio, finally making a shift to creating Overstayer recording equipment, designing and building analog recording equipment in Los Angeles, California. And this is a quote from their website. Being musicians and endless tweakers, our designs evolve with the relationships we have with artists, producers, and recording studios. Every device we sell has been developed through this real-world interaction, and we generally have built dozens of each before they make it to the website. We love analog circuits and classic designs, and especially love developing new and unique devices to record music with. Both Matt Mahaffey and Chris James have raved about the equipment that Jeff has built for them for their studios. I'm excited to learn more about these magic boxes with you, Rockstars. That's what I refer to as our listeners. Please welcome Jeff Turzo to Recording Studio Rockstars. Jeff, my man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Are you ready to rock, dude?
Yes.
Awesome, man. How'd you like your long intro there?
It was great, especially given that I was no help for that, and I apologize.
You know, the wonders of the internet. I was able to get all that info from your website and from Wikipedia. And of course, from what I already know. Now, as I recall, you and I did meet in person at Matt's studio opening, unless I'm mistaken about that. Was that true?
That is true.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, it was brief. So, we didn't nearly have enough time to talk about all the stuff you're doing. But I have known Matt for a long time, and I've known that he's been talking about your gear, as well as Chris James, for years and years. And I've seen, the Overstayer sort of initial designs over at Matt's studio, and then Chris has talked about some cool stuff. But let me stop talking and let me let you talk. Tell us more about like who you are and how you got into all this stuff.
Well, you covered it a bit there. I mean, I started out in music with computers and synths, which is kind of funny because I only build analog gear, really. But I've been using computers to make music since the 80s. So
Nice.
I'm old, and that's what brought me into recording. That's what brought me into music even. I mean, I actually didn't really, I didn't really play music until I did it on a computer. And that sort of led me into playing and piano and things like that. But it really was all driven by the computer. And I started doing that in junior high, and that led to bands and, pretty quickly sequencing, which was pretty, in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of sequencing. There certainly wasn't a lot of computer sequencing, at least around Philadelphia where I'm from. And it just kind of led me deeply into, recording and sequencing, and synth was all sort of interrelated to me.
It was like the Commodore 64 or something. Did they get into MIDI and Atari computers?
I had an Atari, exactly. I had an Atari 520 ST, and then and a sampler pretty early on too, at Casio FZ1.
Nice.
And some synths too, and that just kind of led me down this crazy path that I'm still on. Which electronic music then was very, it wasn't exclusively electronic music I was into, but at least electronic music was so exploratory. It was about so being different, which is the opposite of what a lot of electronic music is now.
So, Jeff, one of the questions I like to ask puts a little bit of a spin on it, too. You talked about these old computers and stuff, but just to kind of bring back the scene, tell us, what did recording and starting out in recording smell like to you?
What did it smell like to me? Well, gosh, I don't really know how to answer that.
Well, I mean, it smelled like old computers.
Yeah, pretty much. Smelled like it smelled like my bedroom.
Right.
Which I never left. My tiny little corner of a teenage bedroom that was sort of all I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Was explore in there,
And so the music that you were really turned on by in the 80s is like Depeche Mode, New Order, bands like that?
Yeah, Depeche Mode. I mean, my favorite band when I was young, my favorite band was Squeeze. And then that led to Depeche Mode, and then Public Enemy. And that combination right there, which was like pop music, very like Squeeze pop, and then Depeche Mode on its own level. These sort of great pop songs. And then the early hip hop, and then Public Enemy is what really sort of like the musically the power, and then bands like Meat Beat Manifesto and things that took like sort of vinyl, turned into what we know, influenced what we know of sampling and powerful music.
Yeah.
And that's what got me going. And then when I was 18, I started working at a studio in Philadelphia called Studio 4. And their sort of claim to fame was they did like Schoolie D and early Jazzy Jeff and all this very early hip hop. Hip hop led my sort of love of that early music, led me to that studio. And then that was sort of another key stepping stone in my story here.
So wait, were they doing like Fresh Prince and Jazzy Jeff? That stuff parents just don't understand?
Yep. So awesome. It's owned by these guys that went as the Butcher Brothers, Joe Nicolo and Phil Nicolo, great guys and super, super great vibe studio, cool little studio in Philadelphia, and really sort of artistically nurturing place. But they were really early on in hip hop, and they didn't do exclusively hip hop, but I spent a year and a half there, and it was just the greatest, the greatest year and a half, because it's where I met the people that I met someone that I ultimately came to California with to be first their sound guy, and then ended up their keyboard player, and then ended up playing Reading Festival, and the band ended up touring with the Beastie Boys and the Rollins Band.
Nice.
So it was just like, it was a whirlwind from 18, and I started as an intern there when I was 18. So, my first year of college was concurrent with my first year of college, and it just didn't help my college career.
Yeah, really.
But it led me in this. It was really it was a whirlwind.
Well, so describe a little bit what the scene was like in Studio 4 when somebody came in to make a hip hop record back then. What was some of the stuff that was laid out all over the tables and in the control room in order to make a record like that?
It was, it was like, for some reason in Philadelphia especially, and maybe all over, but that sequential circuits sampler drum machine, is it the 440, I think?
Yeah.
It was sort of, sequentials like MPC. That was popular there. SP12 would be fairly common. And then, I was such a geek early on. I just like devoured this, every magazine, anything that was technical about all this, I devoured. So I knew about like synchronization and SMPTE and drum machines, which was really novel then.
Yeah.
And plus I was 18. I was the young intern there, but I was like, I was just such a obsessed geek. And so pretty quickly I got to do cool sessions because engineers kind of saw that I was, and I also knew how to run the sequencer. And so it would be these guys bringing in, they're probably just one or two things like that. Mm-hmm. And it would be to tape, and I had to cut tape, and we would, it'd be SMPTE, lock up the drum machine to tape. And
can you describe that a little bit so our listeners who have never used it before sort of get a little bit of a picture of what that means to have SMPTE on a tape?
Yeah, so we had to lay a time code to a track on the tape machine, and I would do this at home too with the 4-track. Put time code on one of the tracks, and that was an absolute time reference, and that allowed you to sync your sequencer up to the tape machine.
Right. So instead of audio coming out of the track, even though it still was audio, not very good sounding audio.
Yeah.
It was like all this digital code that would come off and then go plug into the back of your whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly. And just provide a timing reference. And sync was a loose term because it, didn't line up like what we're used to today. Layering drum, kids layer 90 drums on top of each other without, even a hint of a worry. But, the accuracy was certainly nowhere near that. And so it was challenging, but that's what those sessions were like. And it was awesome. I loved it. I loved those people. I loved being there. They also had a record label called Rough House, which, up until the whole time I was there, Rough House they were putting out good music, but they really didn't have big success. And right when I left, the last thing I was there on, and I wasn't really even in an official capacity, I was just an assistant engineer on a couple nights, was the mix of Cypress Hill's first album.
Wow, and that was a big hit, right?
And and it was life-changing for me because you'd never heard anything like that before. And I was literally there as the mixes were going down, making tapes for them, cassettes, and it was amazing just to experience that as it happened. And that was on their label too. And that was, I believe, Joe Nicolo even mixing it. And it was just an important moment, I think, in music. And it was cool to be a fly on the wall there for a minute. But then, that's right when I left there. And right after that, they went from Cypress Hill to Criss Cross to the Fugees. So nice. Things changed over there when I left.
As in Criss Cross will make you jump.
Yeah, yep.
I totally know that. So Daddy Mac. Well, so describe, like, what was the sound of Cypress Hill that was so new and different? Like, how would you describe that sound?
Well, it had the intensity and the sort of brashness of the collage of these vinyl samples. That was like, there was power and the Bomb Squad did it so incredibly. And then Jack Danger's and Meat Beat Manifesto too. But it was taking elements that, were put together in this almost punk rock way.
Yeah.
To me, like in this just like, they don't totally, musically you wouldn't put these two things together until you hear them together. And then it just creates this power. And that's what was so sort of punk rock about all of it to me.
Yeah.
And that's what Cypress Hill was. But then it was like songs and this the content and the vocals and everything on top of it was so foreign. It's easy to look back now and be like, well, everything is kind of nothing shocking anymore. Right. It's like lyrics and this, but then it was just, you just never, there was nothing like that. And And it just seemed just so powerful to me and had such an impact, you know?
Well, so you talked about SMPTE not being able to sync up the way kids can, people are used to layering infinite number of kick drums now and everything's in sync. That didn't exist then. So what was the way, what did that translate to? Did that mean that you tried to do that stuff anyway and had to be particularly careful with it? Or did it meant that you had to create kick and bass and low end in a record in a different kind of way back then than you would now?
Well, I think we did try and layer, especially, geeks like me that were making music like that. We did layer. It was just a struggle. And I know people used to even delay SMPTE, do things like that to move things around, to be able to try and get things to layer up properly.
What are some of the things that happen if it doesn't layer properly, particularly in low end?
Well, part of it sort of contributed to the sound too. There was leeway, and it's like if you listen back, then it's like, well, there were like sort of things clashing and kicks clashing, and that sort of defined a little bit of the sound of that era, maybe. Mm-hmm. But the other thing was just being smart about. It's forcing you to be an arranger too, forcing you to learn how things, can exist together in a track.
Well, so this is a little bit of a loaded question too. So, as I say, our listeners are who I refer to as the Rockstars. And, my intent for the show is to really educate and dig deep into a lot of questions and assume nothing, So the question kind of points towards, when you have things that are layering up in the low end and they don't sync up properly, do we begin to hear that the low end disappears in and out on a record and in a mix and that sort of thing? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think absolutely just being aware of how the low end is arranged or what's occupying what space in the low end is more important than any piece of gear.
Yeah.
Because there's only certain frequencies, and those frequencies I'll turn into a design geek now, but like there's either short impulses or sustained impulses at any frequency. And that sort of becomes music, even drums, and it's sort of that simplistic in one way. And it's, the thump of a kick and the sub of a kick. There's a sustained sub maybe that decays, and maybe the pitch trails a little bit, and there's a thump that's higher. And it's like, if you're aware of all those things and keeping them clean, or keeping them from clashing other things, that to me is how, balance. It all comes back to balance. It's like, that's why it was called a balance engineer 50 years ago, right?
Totally.
It's the hardest thing to learn, I think, when you're starting, because I think it's like, oh, bass, cool. You know how you make the bass better? Crank the bass up. Yeah. You know how to make the kick drum better? Crank the bass up. And it's like, no, not really. But
yeah, now we want to use all the fancy tools like EQ and compression and phase alignments and things like that.
Yeah. And now it's put a multi-band on it.
Right.
I know how to fix that. Put a multi-band on it.
I'm with you. I think one of the first things I remember discovering, and I feel like I have to continually rediscover it, is that the most powerful mix tool you have is the fader.
Absolutely.
The mute button first, and then the fader.
Yep.
Well, so tell us about forming your band and stuff, transitioning from that stuff, starting your band, God Lives Underwater in LA, or don't let me skip over anything in the middle there.
No, well, kind of getting to that point quickly. I was with David from God Lives Underwater. We were in high school. We had high school bands together, and we made music in high school. And I met him. He was this incredible musician, sort of one of those, a lot like Mahaffey, funnily enough, just this very just music oozed out of him. He could play every instrument. He could, sit at the piano. You could rattle off songs, and he could just play whatever. And he was one of those kids that played when he was like 3. He just started playing piano to his parents' amazement.
Nice.
And so he's this incredible musician, and he loved, like when I met him, it was so interesting because he loved like new wave music and loved Tears for Fears and Depeche Mode. but he also loved the Cocteau Twins, and he introduced me to that, to like 4AD and Cocteau Twins and this music that I didn't know anything about. And that was his just ultimate stuff. And so I knew how to use, he was this incredible musician. And he knew how to use synths and drum machines a little bit, but he was such a good player that he would just play it all. Like the drum machine, he would play down on a 4-track live.
That's awesome.
And it would sound awesome. And he said he didn't really know how to program it as much. And when we met, I knew how to use the sequencer and stuff. And it was just like, you know, it was Reese's peanut butter cup. It was chocolate peanut butter. And so we hit it off and started, and we're both like, we grew up in rural Pennsylvania. So it was, and by the way, when back then, around when we started, we were into new wave music and hip hop, and either one would have gotten you beat up then. Like, this was before, there was a moment, which I think it was the Beastie Boys, which is when the jocks in my school went from wanting to beat you up for listening to hip hop to loving hip hop. And that moment, and it always like left a taste in my mouth as a tangent with the Beastie Boys. I love Paul's Boutique. I think it's a masterpiece. Yeah. But it also, for me, contextually, before that, the Beastie Boys were like, oh, great. Now the dudes that want to beat me up like that. You know, it was a struggling moment for me because it fratted out hip hop. Right. But anyway, so no offense to, because I do.
Well,
I
totally
really
did. It totally did. And just in case your term got lost in there, fratted out as in like frat house rock, as in this is what they were jamming at the frat parties.
Yeah, and it was like those dudes that used to want to kick my ass for listening to hip hop, you know. But anyway, so Dave and I bonded on all that, and so we had bands. And then when I started working at Studio 4, and I joined up with this guy had just come to work on his record there, and he's the one that took me to California. And you know, so I left for like a couple years. I lived in New York, lived in California, traveled, spent some time in England, and I was just like the little 19-year-old sort of techno kid that was the right-hand man to this guy and his band. And as that started to like wind down, I started to see, like I said, we played Reading Festival. It was we played Reading Festival the year Nirvana headlined.
Nice.
It's incredible because I watched that from the stage, watched this iconic moment, you know, right? But I got to do all these cool things, and I got to meet all these cool people. And I egotistically was like, I would call Dave and I'd be like, this is easy. We can get a record deal. I know how to do it now. I was just like so cocky because I'd seen these people. I saw how it worked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of that mystery is just, it's like anything. It's like when the mystery starts to go away, you start to figure it out. And plus I was just cocky. I mean, I was a total nerd, but I was a cocky little nerd.
It helps to be 18, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. And so we sort of devised this plan, like, you know what? I'm going to come back to Pennsylvania when we go on sort of hiatus with this band, and let's work on some music, and let's just take everything we like, which was like, you know, Public Enemy beats and Slayer guitars and Depeche Mode and pop songs. Let's just do that because that's what we love. And a little bit of Cocteau Twins, you know, sort of dreamy guitar in the background. And that's what Goggles Underwater was. And it was totally like fun. There was we just did the first 5 songs, which are probably, I think, our first EP. There was no real, you know, we probably spent a night on each one, you know, which it sounds like a bedroom thing.
Right.
But at that moment it was inspired for us, and we were just having a good time. And I was like, well, I want to send this to the manager of the band that I had sort of run off with. I sent it to him, and he was like, it was so foreign. It sounds so funny now because it's like, yeah, it's electronic music with songs and some guitar. And you say that to people now, and they're like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, it sounds like a million things. And it's like, but then there wasn't real much context for it. And we connected with a guy named Josh Wink, who's a DJ in Philadelphia, who was a friend of ours. And he was also a Billboard reporter DJ, which means all the labels had to like be cool with him because he was one of the 100 DJs they polled every week for the dance chart.
Right. That's such a big thing. I don't know.
Yes.
Is that still such a big thing, or was that sort of a different era?
I don't know, but it was really a big thing then because that's how the chart was made. And so he heard what we were doing and he was like, oh, I love this. I know people that would like this. And so we sent it to 5 labels and all 5 labels called us. Like,
oh man, the bidding war begins.
Yeah, but it was funny. It was a bidding. It was like, wow, this is really cool. This is really different. We don't know what this is, but none of them threw big money at us. And this was sort of before the big money era.
So Nirvana wasn't the big money era yet? That was just the birth of it?
It was sort of before all my friends were getting huge record deals.
Right.
So there was a little bit of that out there, but it was a year or two before the sort of fury of all that. And that plays into my story, actually, because so we had got all this interest, and it was New York and California. And the coolest one was Rick Rubin it was deaf American at the time. It was not American. He had a guy named Gary Richards who he called Techno Boy, who had done the first raves in LA and was just a DJ and a total music lover.
That's right.
And he was working for Deaf American as Techno Boy, and he had brought the label XL, which is Adele and The Prodigy, and now you look at XL, but XL started as a techno label. So he had brought all this cool stuff, and he heard us and was like, this is what my dream was to find some crazy country kids that were making techno music with pop songs. And
that's
so
great.
We totally hit it off. And we came out to meet with him and Rick like took us out and just chatted music, being the charming guy he is. He's so, soft spoken and like, all the geeky things that we said, he was like, what kind of music are you into? And we're like embarrassed, we love Squeeze. we love Squeeze. He loved that. He's like, oh, Squeeze is incredible. Great songs. Cocteau Twin. It was like, it made us feel like, holy crap, he totally gets it. Like because the funny thing about us, and I noticed this in music, is like people would compare us to industrial bands, but we were never industrial. And we didn't even listen to industrial music. It was just, we evolved with these elements that we liked. The closest thing we liked to industrial music was Slayer or Meat Beat Manifesto, but not, but we certainly didn't listen to industrial music. And that was the thing. We were almost like, when we met with them and told him what we were into and he understood it, that we got really excited about that. And then, so we sort of hit it off with him. And the coolest thing about Rick, compared to any other label, and again, this is context because now it seems common, but back then it wasn't, he was like, yeah, you guys are going to record the record yourselves at your house. And no other label was going to let us do that. And that was an important thing for us.
That's super cool. I remember hearing that about Rick too, and sort of the bands that he would help develop, that it was like, yeah, we just want to set you up with your own kind of creative space. I'm trying to remember who I heard that about, but anyway, I think that's super cool. Actually recently I've been watching The Evolution of Hip Hop. I think, is that what it's called? It's on Netflix. It's like a 4-part series, and they talk about Rick Rubin starting out, and they talk about him working with the Beastie Boys and all that, making the very music that kind of was, going to get you beat up early on.
Right. Yeah. Those are important moments. I got to give him a lot of credit. And I look back now, especially, and this is what I was talking about with the bidding war thing that we were getting to. The thing I do is I look back now in hindsight and I realize like how right on he was. And also Mark Geiger, who was the head of A&R there, Mark Geiger started Lollapalooza with Perry Farrell. And anyway, he never liked our band, but he was always honest.
Perry Farrell, speaking of Nothing's Shocking, which you said earlier,
right. But Mark Geiger never liked our band. Rick did. But they were both always giving us this advice that now is so true, which was it's all about making fans, make your art and make fans, and don't worry about anything else. And then that's when that led to like all our friends getting these $1 million record deals. That then the next year or two was these huge record deals. And they were like, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. You understand. Just, we'll keep you on the road. We'll let you make records. We'll do it, but you got to keep it real. You got to make it real. That was always their thing.
Yeah.
Which was the opposite of any other label. And I look back, you know what? They were right. The only important bands from the 90s were indie bands, really. Mm-hmm. Maybe they put out major label records, but the major label system never created important bands. That's the reality of it. The bidding wars, the A&Ring, that system, Rick's system was right, which was the real A&Ring, like let a band develop, and I look back now and I give them.
Some of those major label bands that were getting huge signings, it's such a investment that it's like if they don't have a massive hit right out of the gates, then they immediately fall into just, the dustbin of the music closet for the label. And then, they get caught up in multi-record deals where they can't get out of it and can't do their next thing very effectively. Did you find that was true at all?
Yes, absolutely. And it created like momentary big bands, but not important artistically big bands per se. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I sort of fell victim to it then too, because after that, Gobs Underwater was on 4 labels after that. We had 4 different record deals, but I feel like our mindset was not the right mindset, which was the Rick mindset. We got cocky. And we were weird enough to keep getting second chances. Like we had pop songs and weird stuff. And there was always a new A&R person that was sort of willing to gamble on that. Even though we had a lot of problems as a band, there was a lot of downsides to us just between my partner and I. And just, honestly, it's like my partner had a serious drug problem that was persistent part of our entire career as a band. And it was something that was beyond his control, but it was something that contributed. And it also one of those things that made him a great songwriter, unfortunately, is one of those, these character flaws that allow people to dig into places and create emotional songs.
Totally. It's the conundrum. It's the conundrum of the music scene. It's like, you need a band to be right on the edge of sanity to be really interesting in rock and roll.
Absolutely.
But it's a hard place to survive.
Yeah. But so that led to us, we sort of went into the system, and I think you were describing, or not that we had the big success, but there was certainly the money spent, and it just wasn't as artistically nurturing as what American had created. Right.
Well, one of the questions I like to ask guests on the show, Jeff, is to just kind of share a story about an important failure for you. It sounds like, is there anything around that felt like it was a real important failure and learning lesson, or are we coming up to it when we get into Overstayer?
Well, I think it's with Gobs Underwater that it was, in general, I think having the band not have success was an important failure because it led me down, forced me to always work. And I think the same thing with Mahaffey. No offense to self either, but not having massive success as a band, Mahaffey and I were people that were always working. Yeah. We had I had to have a production career from day one. I always worked on other people's records. The band the band was never, really full time just because our band didn't have that level of success.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about you and Matt working together, because I know you guys did a ton of stuff, and I think you worked on some really cool records.
Yeah. So Matt and I met early on in the early days of Self and Gobs Underwater, and actually MTV 120 Minutes switched our video, put the hit Gobs Underwater as the title of his band and Self as the title of ours.
That's funny.
And it was the debut. It was the first time either of us were on MTV. So that's how. But I loved Self. I heard that actually was turned on to that record from the guys in a cool band called Far. Awesome band from Sacramento. And they played us Self, and I loved it. And so I went to see them at a little club here when they came through LA, and just went and introduced myself to Matt, and we had a lot of similar interests. We're both sort of hillbilly guys that are into making beats. you know, we had this rural but beat making mentality.
Well, that's, Matt was my roommate in Murfreesboro, and he sure enough was producing hip hop tracks, in trade for a Roland 808 machine and stuff like that. Yeah. Had a 4-track, but he told me too, in his own words, that for him, the light bulb moment was seeing Nirvana and hearing those guitars and wanting to like put it all together with hip hop. So it's funny to hear you tell your story, because you guys really do have a similar path towards, working together.
Yeah. So Matt and I sort of hit it off, and then a couple of years later, we kept in touch. And then when him and the whole Tennessee Army moved out here with him, we connected through Ken Andrews, actually, from Failure.
Oh, yeah.
Because I started working with Ken right after Failure sort of broke up. Ken started getting into the computer and synths, and it was early days of Pro Tools. And it was, early days for most people, but for me, it was all old stuff. The Pro Tools wasn't, but just the concepts, I'd already been doing that for 10 or 12 years, And so, which if you'll catch me at the right moment, I'll get bitter about. Especially now, I deal with kids or whatever, and they'll start telling me about synths and, dude, here's how a sequencer works. And I'll have to be like, all right, well, I've been using a sequencer for 30 some years now. So yeah, and I know how to build it now too. So I'll get cocky sometimes like that. But
it's all right, anyway, Jeff, remember, Jeff, beginner's mind. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, met through Ken Andrews, and Matt and I just sort of connected when he moved here. And I was working on a project called Wired All Wrong, which was just making sort of crazy overprogrammed tracks.
Nice.
For no good reason. It was just doing so. It was sort of post Galves Underwater, just making stuff that it was weirdly overprogrammed, but there were guitar, lots of really sort of over edited. And I had no singers. I was just looking for people to collaborate with on the vocals, and spent a year and a half or more working on stuff like that. And actually had a record deal with it at one point with Elektra.
Nice.
With no singers. And then one of the many mergers happened or something, and it never. Anyway, then Matt and I just like, hey, you know what? You should try one. And then 30 minutes later, I get a track back that sounds like Queen.
Right.
And it was just like, whoa, we should do more of this. This is cool. And so that led to Wired All Wrong, and then that led to the Hello Goodbye record, which Forrest was a fan of Matt's. And Matt said, we should produce it together. We'll just do it at my house and your house. And that was the first thing that we produced together.
That's cool. I love that you guys are doing home studios from the start to now through all the transitions,
Yeah. Yeah. And then Hello Goodbye did well. And that led to a sort of a stream of stuff, which was cool. Although it was a delayed reaction, which was kind of funny, is that Hello Goodbye record was out, I think, for a year before the song did, sort of caught on. And so that led to we had a few years of, bands and sort of juggling our own projects. And that was the cool thing about working together, was that we could both have another project happening, and one of us could cover. Right. Matt had cartoon stuff and some, and I had other stuff going on too.
Well, that's cool. Well, Matt, talked about you guys working together, and he said that, you were doing records together. And like you say, he was working on cartoon stuff. You were working on other things. And he described you as you'd show up and you'd, build a piece of gear and bring it into the studio and then build another one, and until eventually, something happened. Was there sort of an aha moment for you through that?
There were two aha moments. Well, one was I also worked on music with Peter Reardon, who has a company called Shadow Hills, which makes this incredible recording equipment.
Yeah.
And I met Peter through my wife, who's a singer. And Peter had done all this great music that my wife played me, that my wife had sort of worked on some songs with him. And again, it's this Houston, sort of rural, but vinyl minded, great taste, beat making, sampling guys. So Peter and I bonded and worked on things off and on together, but always just connected and to play each other music. And so he was sort of dabbling in building things, building compressors, and he had built a couple things, and he was mostly working on monitor controllers because it was right at the time when people were ditching their consoles, and it was like, well, how do we control the volume to the speakers? It was that weird, there was no real solution yet. And people were like, I think we can use Pro Tools without a console, but you can't control the volume of your monitors. So there was no real, there wasn't even like a Mackie Big Knob yet, or anything like that. So
that was a scary time when people actually tried to do that. You actually plugged your computer output straight into the speaker amp.
Yeah, totally. So Peter was working on some really cool things. And funnily enough, they looked like his gear now. Even the monitor controller just looked as intense as this stuff does. So he's always had this aesthetic, this incredible aesthetic to his gear. But I was sort of obsessed with my synths going through good gear and API preamps, basically. I had all these old Brent Averill, made from old parts, Brent Averill 312 pre's. And the synths always sounded so good through that. And, I couldn't afford to have 24 channels of those. So that's what led me to we were sort of into Sunset Sound, Demedio.
Oh, yeah.
These that we got, Peter and I got excited about these things, especially that Demedio.
Can you talk a little bit about Sunset Sound? Because I spent a few weeks there and I was so blown away with their tech department and how they were building their own mic pre's to go in the Studio C console. Maybe you can give us when you reference Sunset Sound, can you let the Rockstars know what you're referring to? Yeah. So, just the allure of Sunset Sound was this Hollywood studio that had done Zeppelin and all this incredible stuff, but Prince and Zeppelin, that's how you can sort of stop there and be like, okay. Their gear was their consoles were custom. They were Sunset Sound consoles. And specifically the stuff that I was excited about were the Demedio consoles, which was this designer, Demedio had, which was pretty common at the time to sort of build a console out of, he didn't design the thing from the ground up. He used API EQs. He used Jensen transformers and op amps a lot. He didn't only, it's every console, a lot of the consoles he built seemed different. I seem to recall that they said something about even using kind of the Jensen schematics.
Yeah,
for designing their pre's.
Yeah, they used the 990 op amps too, which were Jensen's op amp design. So I liked that. Peter and I liked that. So I bought some 990s and some transformers, and I just started messing around because used it as a DI. That's all. I didn't even need an input transformer. So that's what led me down this road. It was, experimenting with those minimal little pieces. Right. Because
starting with the mic preamp, right? Yeah. And so Rockstars, that's just a reminder to you. I mean, the classic journey towards designing gear is almost always start by just building a simple mic preamp. Maybe build even a mic, but
absolutely build a little mic preamp. And now there's a million, kits and DIY sites where you can build this kind of stuff. But what what I always liked about all this and what got me into this, and I think Peter too, not to speak for him, but was starting there, but let's see where it can go kind of. I never wanted to recreate a Demedio. I never wanted to recreate anything. I wanted to start with that little nucleus and then see where I could take it. That's sort of my approach to all this was, I like the history of it, and I'm a student of the history of it, and I like to figure out everything has a place in history, creating recorded music, the art of it, and every console and topology And I'm just such a geek about it. It's like I've forced myself to learn everything about everything.
Yeah.
And just know it like a history student. Like, oh, well, those EQs are this topology, or that is this topology. But also then taking those elements like, okay, here's how they fit in history, and here's how we can use these building blocks. Yeah. And let's take it to new places. And kind
of sounds like your approach to making music too with your band.
It's the same thing. You're totally right. I didn't really think of it like that, but it's exactly that. And so Peter, sort of very early on, after us experimenting with some mic pre's, Peter had that idea to switch the transformer. In context, it's like there was nothing like that then, and now there is. And now there's other companies that have the exact same controls on it, which I struggle with. Morally, I don't know.
Too much
that's
copycat,
a bit of,
you saying?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's how the nature of competition. But anyway, so Peter had this incredible aesthetic and just brilliant ideas. And so Peter started building the stuff, and very quickly his studio became manufacturing. So most of the early listening was here. Like, hey, let's check these transformers, and here's a session with 30 transformers or whatever. We just, all that was done here. And that really was my sort of studying how the intricacies of all this.
Right. So you're doing sessions at your studio, but it's a little bit of a mad scientist lab, yes. And a band comes in to do a record with you, and you've got this freaky thing going on top of a table or behind the console or wherever, probably laid out on the floor or something, right?
Yeah. Yep. And or on a desktop, just some raw stuff. And so up, the early development of the sort of amps and transformers and that I was just sort of Yoko in that process. And,
nice.
or maybe not even Yoko, because I was sort of had an opinion about it all that was relevant. And then I would just do a lot of the listening and a lot of the.
Well, you just called Peter Reardon John Lennon, right? So he'll probably appreciate hearing that on the podcast.
Exactly. So that was one aha moment. And then that led me into working with Matt and working on records. And I was just building gear for myself. So it was all, it was kind of fancy. Some of it was really fancy, expensive parts kind of gear. But the next aha moment was working with Matt for a few years, and then had a couple life-changing events happen. And when I came back around to building gear, I had a totally different approach, which was let's not worry about what's in it, and let's just worry about what it does.
Right.
Like, let's just build off the shelf. Let's build off the shelf. My friends have good ears. I work with lots of great musicians and producers and mixers. And that's how this sort of Overstayer idea started, which was so it's kind of the opposite approach of Shadow Hills, which was very specific aesthetic of this transformer discrete and even specific visual aesthetic that was really great and so strong and inspired, But so the Overstayer was born then, and that's when I was bringing the crazy boxes to Matt. And also Matt and I working with bands, and then we work with mixers. Like we worked with this Swedish band, The Sounds, and then Tim Palmer mixed it. And I took him a little stereo effect compressor I'd worked on. And he was like, "This is awesome. I'll have one of these." and now it was kind of those moments like, whoa, all right. I guess there is a sort of a need out there. And it was that moment too, where, there wasn't much between really inexpensive Guitar Center equipment and, boutique clones or Chandler type, whatever, the expensive.
There was no middle class for studio design gear.
No, now it's like that's a huge world, obviously, partly due to DIY and mass produced old designs or whatever, but it wasn't.
And
then.
Probably just awareness,
Yeah. That's exactly. And part of the awareness, it goes back to plugins. I mean, I realize that the computer has brought analog gear to everybody conceptually, which sounds kind of funny, but that's it. I realize that's what's turning so many people on to analog gear is
People become aware of it that way. Well, so can we talk about some of the gear that you've built? Get to that and just tell us about some of the stuff that you did talk about pre's, but tell us about what is the Overstayer, or is there even one item called the Overstayer? I thought Matt described it as that.
No, that's just the name of my company.
Okay, all right.
But the early stuff that we built, which was a smaller boxes, but the first thing we ever built was stereo. And that was something that my friend, Chris James, and Chris pushed me because I had these funky designs, but Chris was one of the people that was like, I should make it stereo. And I thought, well, stereo it's going to be such a pain because it's a FET and there's all these, parameters of FETs that are hard to match. And anyway, so pretty early on, we just powered through like, all right, I'm going to make it stereo. And I think that was one of the biggest helps to people understanding what we're doing, because connecting to a computer, it's sort of a stereo world. And it's a lot easier for people to integrate stereo equipment to a computer.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, maybe not now.
Because people are taking a pair of outputs out of the computer and going through things.
Now things are a little different now. I mean, the cost of I/O has come down a lot, and people, maybe not as precious with their I/O, but it used to be, well, I got a couple stereo stems. And so I think stereo helped. Also, it was different. It's different using a stereo compressor, especially a FET, like our first little FET, which just sounded so big and fun. Mm-hmm. And it was different. It's different than turning two knobs on two compressors on your stereo drum bus. And that was the big moment for us, was like, I would just take that little thing to people's studios. They would pull up the drums and they'd turn it up, and their eyes would go wide and they'd be like, you're not taking this back, And I think that sort of started where we were headed. But, those designs were a little more simplistic than where I started. At the same time, I was working a lot with like harmonics and saturation and why these things do these things. Not like this circuit will do this, or this circuit will do this, or a tube will do that, or the transformer will do that. My approach was always different than that. Because I feel like some of the way gear is designed now is like, well, I know transformers do something cool, so put a transformer on there. And I know, but it which is sort of true, but the truth is a lot of that stuff has a very narrow range of where it does what it does.
Right.
And that's why sort of my approach is always a little more like, no, let's figure out the core of why these phenomena are happening, instead of like what does them. Let's figure out, well, what is it actually doing, and how else can we do it different
ways? That's cool.
Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. And that led to some harmonics, like some different approaches that, importantly, one of them is called the MAS, which is a product we make now. It's a product I at first hadn't thought maybe it would live on its own, because it would seem like a really important building block, because I just thought conceptually it was a little difficult maybe to convey what it is, which was, it's not a compressor, it's not an equalizer. It's a very forgiving, very wide-ranging sweet spot analog circuit, basically. It's that good thing that a chain of gear will do, because each piece is sort of cumulatively taking a little bit of the peaks and generating a bit of low-order harmonics. And all of a sudden you do that through a big chain, and it's just what comes out the other end is this beautiful thing.
Right, it's a Mobetta box.
Yeah, it's smoothed out, and there are some simple concepts to it, and tape machines do it, obviously, and transformers do it in their way, and tubes do it in their way. But conceptually, an important part that it does as well is the rounding and the leveling affects the performance. It's like when the picking of an acoustic guitar comes off a tape machine, that player played more evenly. You know what I mean? The tape machine contributed to the performance, like it or not. And same with drums. It's like, well, those, however much transient that the tape machine rolled off, didn't exist to the world on playback. Mm-hmm. And Pro Tools now, 20 years later, it's like, well, those transients exist in everything now. And for better or for worse, they didn't there was no way to capture transients on that level, really. And so what I think became the solution over the past, 10, 15, 20 years is put a compressor on that, and then it's putting compressors in places where they never really needed to be. And I love compressors. As coming from someone who builds a million different compressor designs, and loves them, I do feel like it's slapping on a compressor was not always the answer. And so anyway, it was
the nice thing about tape is that, you'd track these things to tape and they'd come back sort of sounding a little bit better at times, for the most part. And if you're going to try and substitute that with compressors, tape didn't have 5 knobs on each channel that you had to set when you sent the sound there. But if you put a compressor on it, you do have, whatever 5. I'm just picking 5 out of the air, but that's probably accurate.
Yeah. And there's no time, the timing artifacts aren't the same. Whereas the timing artifacts of a compressor will change the groove for better or for worse. Yeah. And a lot of times for better. But I think that's the difference with circuits like this. And even just driving a mic pre is the same concept, whereas there is a region where it's not linear anymore, where it's not reproducing the peak fully, but it's also not sounding like overt clipping. Yeah. And that is sort of, all of our gear is just there's a lot of details internally of that going on, where headroom. And so this MAS circuit where I had built these boxes, and this is another thing, and I sort of referenced it on the website, or you brought up that dozens of things exist before they make our website, is, fortunately here in LA, it's like we got to that point where we would build 50 of something, that we never advertised, because there's just enough of a world here. And so that the MAS, or the Master and Servant is what it used to be called, is one of those boxes. And then I started to take it to people. I took, a couple moments, I took one to Eric Valentine, and I had showed him another piece of gear that we had made that he was sort of like, yeah, it's cool, but I don't need it. It was that vibe it was the feedback I got from him. And I'm a huge fan of Eric, and I feel like they made these incredible records, and I've fortunately gotten to work with him on some stuff. But I took the MAS when I was picking up the other box, and I said, hey, check out this other thing. And I just left it with him, and I got an email back like, whoa, what is that? And Eric has no need for a tape machine, certainly no need for a tape emulator, which it's not. But it's just, this is what people started to reference the MAS as something that's similar in that way. And Eric, and then Joe Zook, and a couple other people who I really respect, had the reaction to this box. And that circuitry sort of started to become part of our DNA.
That's cool.
And that has led, and it's not the same. It's more of a concept than a specific circuit.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about this stuff that you've been building with Chris? Is that something we're allowed to talk about? I know you guys have been working on a pretty cool concept for him and his studio.
Yeah. So he has some pieces of we built a thing called the Modular channel, which it has filters, EQ, compression, and all these harmonic stages throughout. It's something that evolved not to throw everything in one box. It evolved because to me, the great music was created on systems, a console and a tape machine, a musical system, or whatever. I feel like that, to me, is what's missing. And that's what the concepts of Eurorack and 500 series and plugins have forced people to break everything into the tiniest pieces. And I don't necessarily, and there's no offense to any of that, but I don't think that's how great music was made. I think it's the opposite, which is the integration of things. Yeah. Well, the console was a system of, and I feel because everything is interactive. Well, you turn up the gain and then the EQ, and you turn up the low end on the EQ, and it's pushing the channel gain. So I'm going to turn the channel gain down and turn the compressor. And you're sort of you're not thinking about one component at one time. You're thinking about the whole fluid stream of things.
In the same way that a band of musicians together is looking for kind of a sweet spot of a performance.
Exactly.
The gear in a studio, when it all is dialed in just right, you find this sweet spot where everything just seems to sound great.
Exactly. And it happens like, as simplistically as pedals. It's like, if you put 3 pedals up and you really start dialing, there's some magical little sweet spot that's going to happen.
Right.
It almost doesn't matter what the 3 pedals are. You know what I mean? There's something that one piece won't do that multiple pieces, will inspire. And that's a big part of how I design gear is that. And so the modular channel that Chris has some now, and we have some more in development, is that where it's this really interactive. And they're stereo too, which is back to our stereo thing. But they're highly interactive. They're hi-fi too, which is another thing. Is all of our tweaky gear, like we have a lot of stuff that filters and res and a lot of synth concepts, resonance that goes into oscillation, and things that are associated maybe more with synths and or pedals and harmonics and circuits that distort. But it's all built really hi-fi. Nice. It's all built like a console. And not like we took a guitar thing and put it in a line level box.
Right.
And truthfully, the guitar things, a lot of them evolved from, the early distortion pedals evolved from recording gear. So, nice. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Chris kind of described it as a system that would allow him to mix. And, not everything that comes out of a mix, if you're going to break it out through sort of a console, is the same. Some things are drums and bass, some things are vocals, some things are guitar subgroups. And it sounded like you guys were designing channels that would accommodate each of those things and, in a really great way. Yeah.
So the modular channels, and I know Chris sort of uses them like that on buses, and they really sort of allow you to tailor to each one of those things. Like, in drums, you use the filters and EQs and the compression, and it does like this. And then, so there's a couple different versions of these things with a couple different styles of compression that lend themselves more to, one would lend itself more to vocals, or one would lend itself more to drums.
That's cool.
So, and then there's some for the master bus too. And then on that same concept, we have channels coming now that are very integrated in that same way. They're mono channels, they're mic line DI, but they all have some sort of EQ and harmonics, and a few of them have compression too. And again, the idea is not to throw everything in one box, but the idea is I'm just want to create these systems like EMI did, EMI's console and SSL even, but even earlier than that, it's that it is a musical system.
Well, let me ask you a few questions that'll spin it back towards recording for a sec.
Yeah.
Let me break it down into some instrument stuff and just sort of respond to these as you want. Share sort of a great approach to mixing drums. What are a couple of things that can really make drums just sound fantastic in a mix?
I think one of the biggest things that you can do is do something, and not necessarily with our gear, but to deal with the transients in a way that's not compression. Start without, you know what I mean? Deal with the dynamic range before doing any compression. Deal with the dynamic range, with something that will limit the transients in a pleasing way. I mean, we make things that do it, but there's other ways to do it as well. But I think to me, that's a vital part of making drums sound. I think my point of reference is always like, I love the art of records, like probably specifically records from 1950 to 1985. Or just to mean to the golden age of the art of recording. And not to say great stuff hasn't been done since then. But I'm just saying virtually everything from there has merit. Everything in that window, to me, has merit to what I love about the art of recording.
That's cool.
So I feel like that's where my, advice is coming from.
And that's cool. So when you talk about not reaching for a compressor to deal with the drums, we're talking about, tape if you've got it, or something that emulates tape, or something like what you're designing, which it's hard to describe because it just borrows from all these characteristics. But
and
you know,
saturation
and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Finding the sweet spot of gear. And even, you know, chips have bad name, whatever. I mean, generally any decent gear, you could find a sweet spot that will start to become nonlinear, where it will start to round off transients.
But so now for people that are in home studios working in computers, we're talking about potentially running a mix of drums out of the computer and through some physical gear, analog gear, and back into the computer.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. I'm sure I don't have, being the old computer head I have, my computer brain stopped a long time ago. I mean, I have a somewhat current system and I've used current plugins, but I couldn't, advise on the plugins that do it, but I'm sure there's ways you can do it with the plugins as well.
Oh, that's all right. Let's just keep talking about concepts. Now, what about bass? What are some great things that people need to know about making bass sound fantastic?
For me, and I guess it depends on where, the amp would provide this, or the bass itself, or a good DI would sometimes provide it. But again, it's using harmonics and leveling it probably without compression first.
Can you describe what harmonics are?
Well, so the second harmonic is an octave up. The third harmonic is an octave and a fifth. And a lot of gear that we seem to like will generate those low order harmonics.
Yeah.
In a pretty pure way.
Just this is a trick question, but is there a particular guitar chord that we also really like that is an octave and a fifth?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a power chord, Rockstars. That's a power chord.
Yeah, and that's a great way to put it. So there you go. And obviously it's like if you add an octave up to a bass, it's, pleasing.
Yeah. The harmonics above that? Don't we get into a major third? Is that one of the next harmonics?
Yeah, I was at the fourth harmonic, which would also be pleasing.
I have a tube amp here. I think it's called a True Tone. It's a little teeny one. And I noticed when I would play power chords through it, I can hear the major third. So I guess that's cool. Just the way it distorts, and I always really like that about it.
Yep. So again, sort of doing that and leveling the peaks again without a compressor first. I'm not saying don't compress because I love compression.
Right.
But I feel like that, and a lot of times the amp and the player did that, which is another conversation, which is, well, a lot of this goes back to the player too, when you really start to analyze like the records we love, and then you learn about the Swampers and a few, you start to think like, oh shoot, well, maybe there was only a half dozen drummers on all these incredible records.
Right. It's the same guy I like so much.
Yeah, like, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't the gear. So anyway, so not to underestimate the source. The source is the key.
Now, what about vocals? What are some treatments to vocals that really make them sound great? Let me guess, harmonics.
Yeah, that too. I mean, I like optical compressors on vocals, I think. I like that sort of fail-safeness of an optical compressor on a vocal.
Can you please explain in a simple way what an optical compressor is?
So an optical compressor, I'd be referencing like an LA2A, LA3A, or Manley LOP. But it uses an electroluminescent panel, or an LED, to light into a light-dependent resistor. So the audio triggers the brightness of the LED, which triggers the amount of compression on the light-dependent resistor. And what that means is this slow sort of auto gain or auto process, which just compresses in a pleasing way. It rides the average level in a musical way.
I love it. So basically what you're telling us is the music we're putting into an opto compressor is creating a disco party inside it that nobody can see except for the compressor.
Exactly.
That's cool.
And it's, and I think for that is another thing that happens with compression is sometimes when you don't hear it, it's working cool too. Like an opto compressor, what might not be as exciting as a something that's really aggressive and bitey.
Right.
But it might be doing a better job of that same phenomenon, which was keeping your picking even, or your play, or limiting your transients. It's that same, like, ultimately we also just want to hear the music more consistent. That just sounds better to our ears.
Yeah, I think it's because the musician is conveying, communicating a musical idea, and really great compression and, treatment of a sound just simply makes it, I like to call it graphic. It just paints a really easy to see picture of what's going on musically.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I had a few people that have sort of showed me on a Fairchild some incredible things that they've done on a Fairchild. And granted, it's a ridiculously expensive now vintage compressor. But anyway, all the things that they would do were these they don't sound overtly compressed, and just these are incredible records. But I won't name who they were or what it is. But I'll just say that they're sort of classics to me. But the thing that struck me was that they were all done on like the sort of slower auto settings of a people associate a Fairchild with like this, slam or to put the rooms through the fair or whatever.
Right.
But it just, I guess the point being is that, this sort of, when you're not noticing it as a compressor and more of it's like someone riding the fader, that's some beautiful, that can be a really sort of what compressors were maybe designed for originally.
Yeah. And when
you're
really
useful.
When you're in the computer and you're sort of trying to experience this not notice it difference, Rockstars, it's sort of the experience of putting plugins on things and taking it in and out of bypass. And if you just hear a little bit of improvement, sometimes that's what you needed from that particular plugin, Doesn't have to be a drastic big thing. You don't have to have some explosive difference between the two.
Yep.
Well, so Jeff, we're going to take a break here and we'll come back in for the jam session. But Rockstars, before we go, I just want to remind you that we will have links to stuff we're talking about here with Jeff Turzo in the show notes. You can find the show notes for this episode. If you're on your iPhone, you can just find it right in the podcast app right there, and you can click through with your finger to take you right to the website and get more of the info. As well, you can go straight to the website at recordingstudiorockstars.com. And if you enjoyed the music at the beginning of the show, that's actually my record, Skadoosh, and you can check that out at skadooshmusic.com, SKADOOSH. And also, if you'd like to get yourself a t-shirt and let the world know that you are indeed a rock star, go check that out at rsrockstars.com/t-shirt. We'll see you guys in a moment for the jam session. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks. And you get downloadable multi-tracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multi-track files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record, Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, Rockstars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. Hey, Rockstars, we're back. My guest today is Jeff Turzo from Overstayer Recording Equipment in Los Angeles, and we're going to jump into the jam session. Jeff, are you ready to jam?
Yes.
Awesome, dude. When you were starting out in recording, what was one of the things that was holding you back?
what was holding me back when I was starting recording, I didn't have very much musical ability, which I think is really important in recording.
To have musical ability, or to know that you don't have it?
For me, since I wasn't recording other people, since it was me recording myself, it was developing that, which I think took time.
How do you think, if you were to put it in a sentence, how do you think you did develop musical ability?
Just by playing. I mean, I think that and playing with people.
Yeah.
Because that forces, to me, it's like learning a language. It's immersion is the best way to learn, I think.
Nice. I like that. Well, now, how about some of the best advice you received? The best advice I received were the things probably that took the longest to understand, but they, goes back to some of the things we talked about, which was music, mixing, recording is balancing. Yeah.
And that's something I'm still learning. I'm still learning all of this, but that's definitely probably the thing that I come back to. Give
us a trick that you still use now to help you balance something when you're feeling uncertain. What's the first things you do when you're trying to figure that out?
Well, I think the critical is know how to reference. Know levels. Know how to reference different things to each other. Know when it's useful to reference peak level. Know when it's useful to reference RMS level, and stick to those. Don't just reference things arbitrarily.
Good God. Can you give us some insight into both those things? Because I'm looking at them all the time now, and I like to think I know what I'm looking at, but I probably don't.
Well, and for me, it's critical because it's like the only way to know that you're getting anywhere when you're designing a piece of gear is to accurately reference. Otherwise, it's arbitrary. If you turn your, something that's louder is always going to sound better.
Yeah.
Generally, and you can look at the EQ is different. You can look at the Fletcher-Munson curve and you can look that graph up, and you'll see as you turn your speakers up that your ear is doing that EQ at each step of the level. So just keep that in mind. And so the only way to truly reference two things is that they're both at the same level.
Well, so give us a one paragraph description of the Fletcher-Munson curve, and what is that difference?
It's as signals are quieter, basically you hear less low end. Really simplistically.
Yeah.
And the focus is humans evolved to hear mid-range, human voice, basically,
yeah.
I guess it would be. And so it's knowing how to accurately reference other things and knowing when the peak low, like here's a trick, and then I think it's something that a lot of people know, but I'll still come across people that are experienced that don't, but know when the dynamic range, especially now, dynamic range, if you're going to reference to other mixes, dynamic range is such a tricky thing now, the way records are mastered, that if you're going to reference other mixes, you can't reference them to an absolute level. It makes no sense to reference to an absolute level as you're working on a mix, because your mix should not have the dynamic range of a master as you're working on it.
It should have more dynamic range?
It should have more dynamic range. This is based on most of the masters that I see now. Mm-hmm. If you're mastering against current stuff, which has 8 or 9 dB of dynamic range a lot of the time, I don't feel like your mix should have 8 or 9 dB of dynamic range.
Only when you send it to the label for approval.
Exactly. So in that case, I think it can be useful if you're looking for tonal references. It's more useful to give yourself headroom and then
turn down the reference track a lot.
Exactly. And reference them at some sort of average at RMS level, and you can hear tonal differences, and then worry about dynamics a bit.
So Rockstars, at the risk of stating the obvious, I'm going to over-explain this. So this means if you put a limiter on the end of your mix bus while you're mixing to try and get your mix to be as loud as the masters you're referencing, you're going to push your dynamic range smaller, and you're going to push the loudness of your RMS mix up into that 8 to 9 dB range. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Jeff, but it's going to cause you to think you're getting closer to that master, but you're killing your ability of the mastering engineer later to really manipulate the music. Maybe, Jeff, you want to explain why you don't want to push your mix up into that limited dynamic range while you're mixing.
Well, I will preface this by saying I don't think there's any reason to ever put your dynamic range there.
Okay.
But that's a whole nother conversation. Because I, if we can dissect the record industry, that'll go down a scary rabbit hole. But I think in general, you'll have more options if you're not working into that much compression or limiting. You have more balance options.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
If you're not working that hard. And some people I'm sure can do it, but,
well, let's put it this way. It could be that your mix is out of balance because something that's big and has a lot of low end really needs to be turned way up. Maybe that's where your mix is at. And if you don't have anywhere to go, you can't ever turn it up to discover that that's where it needed to be.
Exactly.
Sweet. We figured it out, man. We cracked the code.
Cracked the code.
All right. Now, how about sharing with the Rockstars a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that they could use in the studio today on their next session?
Oh, wow.
Let's take it to heavy guitars for a minute, because you didn't get a chance to talk about that much, but I know that that's an important part of, or has been an important part of making music for you.
Gosh, I have to say I'm pretty low tech when it comes to that kind of stuff. I'll preface it by saying this. The first Gallows Underwater records were done by playing the guitar through a quadriverb into a sampler and then playing a measure or two at a time, and then triggering the measure or two samples as with a sequencer.
Wow.
So I was pretty low tech, and I still go back to those days. Here's a thing that I like as a tweaker, and this goes sort of but it's not an analog tip. But and if you listen to Wired All Wrong or any of the stuff like Matt and I've done and stuff for other people, is this is going to be total sacrilege to some people, but I would use Amp Farm a lot. And what it would allow me to do is I would play into the computer with Amp Farm, and then I could do all my tweaky edits, but I'd be editing the clean guitar.
Oh, much easier to see what's going on.
Yeah, and also when I say tweaky edits, it's like it wasn't editing to make a better performance. It was editing to abuse and using Audio Suite plugins and doing things to create. And because it was creating on the clean and then into the distortion, you could do it opens up a huge it opens up creative possibilities.
Yeah,
working like that.
Well, I actually think you just shared a huge insight, even though you were trying to be humble about it, which is that I think it's common to discover that really bold, aggressive guitar work on heavy guitar albums. In fact, I'm even thinking of Black Sabbath Paranoid, that direct guitars have for a long time been kind of a secret towards getting in your face, big ass guitar sounds, not using the one that necessarily sounds like the really expensive one at Guitar Center, but you taking guitars and going through a quadriverb. So Rockstars, that was the Elisa's quadriverb, which was like $100 back then. I mean, maybe it was more, but it was a really inexpensive piece of effect gear. It was an effects unit, right?
Yep. Quadriverb GT. It had a little extra distortion on it, but it was effects. And and that reminds me of another important thing that I think maybe plugins have made challenging, which is master a couple things. Pick a couple. I feel like that's what I don't see is everyone has access to everything.
Right.
We'll throw something different on there. You know what? If we want to make it better, throw something new on it. And I feel like that a better approach might be to limit yourself to one or two things and see what you can get out of them.
All right. I'm going to throw out a great follow-up great. You can tell me if you think it's great or not, but it's an idea I'm having. So Rockstars, you're probably in a DAW, you're probably in your computer making records. And what Jeff's referring to, and makes sense, is you've got endless number of plugins available. You know, you probably bought a bunch already. You may have a lot. If you find yourself in that zone, don't forget, you could always just take a bunch of those plugins, put them in the unused plugins folder before you open Pro Tools, and start your session with a limited supply of plugins and just decide that's what you're going to make this record with. You know, go get one if you need it, but that would be similar to how maybe we made records in the analog days where, you know, you've just got that console, you got that tape machine, you got a handful of mics, let's go.
Absolutely. I think just historically, I was reading about, for some reason, Bowie came up, Ziggy Stardust. And I think this is a theme for a lot of stuff, is that it goes the same for analog gear. A lot of these classic records we love, they didn't have a ton of outboard either.
Yeah.
You know, so it's the same concept, I think.
Yeah. I heard a great story about Jimi Hendrix at Electric Ladyland when the engineer or the technician brought in this new box and they hooked it up to the console, and it was a box and it just had one giant knob on it. And they were like, watch this. And they started with the knob over to the left and they put the guitar in, and it panned the guitar to the left-hand side of the stereo mix. And then they swept the knob around and it swept it across to the right side of the mix. It was a pan knob. It was the first pan knob.
That's awesome.
But they didn't have one on every channel. They had to bring in the box and use that one trick. And if you know the early Hendrix records, you hear that like crazy.
All right. That's awesome.
All right. So now how about a favorite hardware tool, something physical that you really like to have with you on sessions? And it doesn't even have to be, you know, audio outboard gear. It can be anything you think of.
Wow, that's a tough one now. I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask.
I mean, you made records in the studio. What did you like having? A guitar, a drum machine, a sampler?
Yeah, I mean, a sequencer and a sampler,
Okay.
I think were the most important things for me. Yeah.
Even when computers came along and we're in Pro Tools, do you still like using outboard sequencers?
I sequence in the computer, but I still use samplers. I have an Akai Z4 and an S612 set up right here, right next to me.
And then you use some sort of box that converts it to MIDI signal on the way out of the computer, or to CV for control voltage?
Yes, I use an Elysium Copperland MIDI interface, which I believe is not made anymore. But if you want to geek out, look up Copperland. It's an Ethernet protocol. So it's not using USB to connect to the MIDI devices. It's using Ethernet.
Cool.
It's an interesting, very geeky way to connect to outboard equipment.
Well, we like geeky on Recording Studio Rockstars. So how about a favorite software tool? I know you sort of self-admitted, you know, your computer sort of dates back a little bit, but talk about some of your favorite stuff in the computer.
My favorite software tool, that's a good question now. It's so simplistic. I live and love my meter, which is this Massey plugins meter, which just is probably the most important thing in my computer. For me, most important plugin I have.
Which one is that? I don't know the meter.
It was a free one that he made. Stephen
cool.
Massey, I guess his name is.
Yeah.
I loved his plugins. And he made this plugin called HR Meter, and it just shows peak and average volume.
Very cool.
And it's real simple and it works. So that's an important tool for me.
I use one of his plugins called the L2007, which is a great limiter. And that's the one that I can turn it up so loud that your meter won't show any more dynamic range. All right. So now how about a resource for the business side of this? You know, for people who are interested in operating their studio, making records, and they want to do it not just as a hobby, but for a living. What advice do you have, or do you have any good, cool online resource for sort of doing your business well?
I don't have any. I mean, I'm sure they're out there, but I probably wouldn't be the one to guide you there.
You know, it's not your fault. The way I asked the question was terrible. It's do your business is something I tell my dog to do in the yard. So that's the wrong way to ask the question there. Well, so now how about organizational stuff? I mean, you must have to keep a lot of things organized for building your gear and running your business. Do you have any online resources that you use just for staying organized?
Yes, I use Trello, which I really love.
Awesome. Can you describe that or sort of hip us to what that's all about?
Trello is sort of like online index cards that you can move around on a board. And then you can have several boards, and it's free. It helps me a lot because, we've got lists upon lists upon lists, and highly recommend it.
Is it something that you might use even if you were making a record and writing songs?
Totally. It could do that part too, the dry erase board, where you could move cards around. It's sort of like a cork board with cards on it. And it's just real simple and direct, and I find it really helpful.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we're getting into the last two questions here, and they're both hypothetical. But this one imagines that you're starting over, or you're giving advice to somebody who's just kind of starting out, and you needed a simple setup to record with. You need to find people to make music and record, and you got to make ends meet while you're kind of getting yourself, situated. What advice would you give to people? What's the simple setup, how to find people, and how to make ends meet?
Well, a simple setup, I think, would be a computer, a DAW setup that you're comfortable in with one good chain to get into it. And with that, you could pretty much, you could do a lot. And then connecting with people, that's in this day and age, I wouldn't know how to tell you to do that.
Okay.
But keep it artistic. That'd be my, whatever, anyone would pursue, I would say pursue it on an artistic level, because I feel like that my friends that I see have success. It's like, if you pursue it artistically, the success comes. Mm-hmm. But it's shooting for the success first that maybe is a little harder.
Well, it's that advice that you got from Rick Rubin. It's the same attitude, right?
I feel like it's easier to be if you're shooting for sort of pop success off the bat, you're following. And I think the way I've seen pop music work is that pop music swings around to people who are leading, and so you can be on, in that group of people, you could be at the front of it or you can be at the back of it.
Yeah.
It depends where you want to be. But I do feel like people that do step out and push things in different directions, even, things like pop music come around to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Not in every concept, actually. But I think that's something I see with people, with kids, especially now, that it's like, for some reason, this mentality of like, build your brand or this or that, it's sort of gotten in the way of like, no, make some pure art first.
Nice.
And then let that come, let the world come around to it.
Well, I like that advice, because whenever I get a message that says build your brand, even if I appreciate the message, it stresses me out. And when I get a message that says go do your pure art, it's more relaxing,
Yeah.
So it's good
Quality
advice.
of life.
All right. So final question. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine now, Jeff, and go back, and we're going to meet young Jeff, 18-year-old. You're going to go tap yourself on the shoulder. You turn around and say, what are you doing here, old Jeff? And you say, well, I've come to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself today. What advice would you give yourself?
Don't worry about what people think and go with your instincts.
Nice. All right. I like it. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us, man. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. And I love hearing your stories of building all this cool stuff. I just wish I was listening to it right now.
Well, thanks for having me. Well, we'll have to connect here at some point.
How can the Rockstars find out more about you? How can they check out your gear? If they wanted to buy it, where did they go? All these things.
You can look up our website, overstayeraudio.com, and then you can also go to Vintage King, and we have dealers throughout the world, actually. And that's that. Do
you guys do the audio example kind of thing online too, or is that part of how you demonstrate what the Overstayer stuff does?
We have not so much done it ourselves, but we've had some users do it. There are some YouTube videos up. There are, I think, some SoundCloud examples, and there's been some posts and some forums of people showing what some of the stuff can do.
Okay, cool. If it's all right with you, I'll include links to those YouTube clips in the show notes so that people can check it out easily.
Yep.
Groovy. Well, Jeff, thanks so much, man. It was great hanging out with you, and I look forward to seeing you around the studio and hearing your gear, too.
Thanks a lot, Lidge. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, man. Cheers. Talk soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lidge Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.